rain that night didn't fall gently. It came down hard, slicing through the city as if it were trying to wash something painful away. Red and blue lights bled into the wet asphalt, trembling with every pulse of the sirens. In the middle of it all sat the police dog, a German shepherd, his paws planted firmly on the road, his body tense but unmoving. Officers called out to him, tugged gently at his leash, repeated commands he had obeyed 1,000 times before. This time, he refused. His eyes never left the little girl standing across the street, barefoot on the freezing pavement, wrapped in a thin hospital blanket that did nothing to stop her shaking. She wasn't trembling from the cold alone. There was something deeper in her eyes, something broken. No one could understand why a fully trained police dog would not move. He was taught to follow orders, to release, to return. Yet he stayed, breathing slow and heavy, as if holding himself together by force of will. It felt as though if he took even one step away, something irreversible would happen. The girl lifted her foot, hesitated, then lowered it again. Fear lived in her small body, but beneath it was recognition, quiet, aching, undeniable. In that suspended moment, the city sensed it without knowing why. This was not just a rescue scene, this was waiting. And behind that waiting was a truth so powerful it would leave everyone shaken. The rain had been falling for hours, but that night it seemed determined to wash the city bare, to strip every surface down to its raw, vulnerable bones. The neon lights of storefronts flickered in the puddles that pooled along the cracked asphalt, bleeding red and blue into the darkness like fading wounds. Every siren in the distance added to the city's pulse, yet in the middle of that chaos sat a single figure unmoving, a German shepherd, eyes sharp, ears flicked slightly forward, and his body coiled with a quiet, unyielding energy. His paws pressed into the wet street, claws scraping the asphalt every time he shifted, and yet he did not take a step forward. He did not obey the commands that came in measured tones from the police officers around him. They tugged at his leash, repeated his name, tried to coax him into motion, but nothing pierced the invisible line he had drawn. His gaze, steady and unwavering, locked onto a small figure standing across the street. The girl was wrapped in a thin hospital blanket, barefoot, shivering from cold and something heavier, fear, maybe, or exhaustion too deep to name. Her hair was damp and clung to her face in strands, plastered against pale skin that glowed ghostly under the street lamp. She took one tentative step, then another, her tiny feet meeting the puddles with muted splashes, each one reflecting the world upside down. In the eyes of the dog, those steps were not just movements. They were signals, delicate and tentative, and he waited. He had waited before for commands, for signals, for sense, but never like this. This was different. There was a thread of recognition in his gaze, something that tied him to the child in ways no officer could explain. Around them, the city pressed in. A small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk, umbrellas shaking with wind, eyes wide behind rain-streaked glasses. The smell of wet concrete, gasoline, and copper from old storm drains filled the air sharp and metallic. Somewhere, a stray dog barked, a distant wail that only seemed to heighten the tension. Officers shifted uneasily, their radios crackling, their voices clipped with professional urgency. But even they paused, sensing that this was no ordinary standoff. Commands had failed. Orders were meaningless. It was as if the dog and the child had entered a bubble, a world paused in the rain where nothing else mattered. She looked at him, and for a moment, time seemed to fold. Her eyes, wide and glimmering, reflected not just the streetlights, but the strange, piercing intelligence in his. She had cried before, quietly, desperately, but now her breath hitched for a different reason. Relief? Curiosity? Hope? She could not name it, but the trembling that had gripped her body softened. Her lips parted as if to speak, then closed again. The dog remained still, yet every muscle in his body radiated attention, as if he could feel every tremor of fear, every heartbeat, every unspoken thought. The officers whispered to one another, "Move him. Get her inside. We can't. He won't." But the words were weak here. The dog's refusal was not aggression, not stubbornness, not disobedience. It was loyalty, yes, but more profound than that. It was recognition of a fragility the world had ignored, a silent understanding of a life that had spent too long unseen. Rain streaked down his muzzle, wetting the coarse fur of his face, but he did not shake it off. His head remained level, ears alert, eyes locked in a vigil that defied reason. Every instinct in the officer screamed that he should return to his handler. that the child should be swept to safety, yet neither could make a move that would break the spell. The girl inched closer, barefoot on the wet pavement, her small hands gripping the blanket tighter around her thin shoulders. Her movements were hesitant, a mix of fear and trust, and as she neared, the dog shifted slightly. Not forward, but a fraction of an inch, a gesture that said, "I am here. You are safe." The world around them, the rain, the street lights, the murmuring crowd, faded into background noise. For a brief, suspended heartbeat, there was only this connection, delicate and fragile, yet as unbreakable as steel. The crowd whispered, some in awe, some in skepticism. "It's just a dog. It won't bite. What's wrong with him?" None of them could see the thread of truth in that gaze, the quiet insistence that nothing would happen until she was ready, until she stepped forward on her own. The city had seen rescues before, had seen dogs and humans working together, had seen fear dissolved into action, but never like this. Here, the roles had reversed. The dog was the guardian, the child the one giving permission, and the rules of the world bent quietly around them. She stopped just a few feet from him. Her small chest rose and fell rapidly, her toes numb in puddles that reflected the neon chaos above. Her eyes filled with unshed tears, and she whispered something barely audible, a single word that only he could understand. The German shepherd's ears twitched, and then the almost imperceptible shift in his posture told her something she didn't yet know how to feel. He trusted her. He had waited for her. And the weight of that trust settled into her chest, heavier than the blanket around her shoulders, yet somehow warm. For the first time since the night began, a sound came from the dog that no one had expected, a low, gentle whine that resonated more in emotion than in warning. It vibrated through the puddles, through the asphalt, and into the bones of everyone watching. The girl's lips trembled into the faintest curve of a smile. She stepped closer, ever so slightly, and the dog shifted again, small and deliberate. Rain fell unnoticed, soaking their hair and fur, their clothes and paws, as if the heavens themselves were trying to mark the moment. And then, as if the city itself held its breath, she reached out a trembling hand. It hovered over his head for a moment, uncertain, hesitant. His eyes softened, his ears relaxed fractionally, and when her fingers finally brushed his damp fur, a small, almost imperceptible wag of the tail followed. That single gesture, light, tender, deliberate, sent a ripple through everyone present. The police officers exhaled collectively. The crowd stepped back. The world was heavy, wet, chaotic, and yet, in that small moment, it was perfect. A fragile bond had been formed, one built on trust, understanding, and the quiet insistence that some things cannot be rushed. In the heart of the storm, standing in the middle of a neon-lit street slick with rain, the city had witnessed the impossible. A dog refusing to leave, a child learning to trust, and a world that, even for a moment, held its breath for both of them. Time moved on around them. Cars splashed past. Sirens continued their distant wail, and people eventually drifted away. But the thread connecting them remained unbroken, invisible yet undeniable. That night, under the relentless rain, the German shepherd had chosen. And the choice was waiting, steadfast and patient, until the little girl was ready to step into a world that had almost forgotten her. The stairwell smelled of damp concrete and old cooking oil, a bitter, persistent odor that seemed to seep into every pore. Each step echoed under the weight of boots, a hollow, hesitant sound that seemed almost too loud for the silence pressing in from the narrow walls. Rex moved ahead of the officers, muscles coiled, paws whispering over cracked tiles, nose twitching as though it could read the history of the building from the damp air. The rain from outside had seeped in through the broken window frames and rusted pipes, leaving streaks along the walls and puddles along the edges where paint had peeled away. Somewhere in the distance, a faucet dripped, a metronome marking the passage of tension in a space where time felt thin and heavy. The call had been simple on paper. Welfare check on a child whose neighbors had reported crying that never stopped. Routine, the dispatch had said, the kind of task that police officers learn to perform with minimal emotion, minimal attention, just tick the boxes and move on. But in every routine, there lurked something unsaid, a chance for the unexpected to carve its way into memory. And Rex, trained for alertness and instinct, felt it immediately. On the third floor, the sound of crying intensified, not loud, not frantic, but a thin, rasped wail that had already spent itself, the kind of sound that gnaws at the edges of a soul. Rex paused at the threshold of the door. His ears flattened slightly, his tail stiffening. The officers exchanged glances, their hands hovering over the door frame, the metallic tang of fear mingling with the smell of mildew. Rex stepped forward, muscles rolling beneath his coat in fluid waves, then lay down at the corner, low and deliberate, his head level with the floor. He was calm, almost impossibly so, yet every sense screamed that something fragile and vital awaited. Inside, the apartment was dark, lit only by the thin streaks of gray light that leaked through tightly drawn curtains. The furniture was sparse, dust-covered, with the faint odor of neglect clinging to every surface. On the floor, a mattress lay without sheets, the thin pillow flattened and stained. And on it, curled into herself, was the little girl. She was small for her age, skin pale under the dim light, ribs faintly visible under the thin cotton of her dress. Her hair hung in matted strands, eyes wide and untrusting, fixed on the shadow of the dog lying inches away. Rex did not move closer. Forwards. He did not bark, did not growl, did not sniff aggressively. He merely watched, breathing slow and deliberate, chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm with the soft sobs that slipped from the girl's throat. He sensed every tremor in her tiny body, every heartbeat, every flicker of fear that pulsed through her like an electric current. And in that watching, he gave her permission to breathe, permission to exist without the immediate terror of the world crashing down. The officers whispered between themselves, their voices low, careful not to disturb the fragile equilibrium. "She's so small, so alone," one murmured. Another nodded, eyes scanning the apartment with professional alertness. "He let him do it," someone said finally, almost reluctantly. "But don't push her. Let him lead." And so they watched as the dog, trained for obedience and pursuit, became something else entirely, a guardian, a bridge between fear and safety, a steady heartbeat in the silence of neglect. Slowly, the girl's trembling lessened. Her eyes, wide and wary, began to soften as she observed the dog not as a threat, not as a machine, but as a presence she could measure, trust, and maybe even like. She did not reach out yet. Her hands remained tucked beneath the blanket she had clutched so tightly for warmth and protection. But she watched him, memorizing the movement of his chest, the shift of his ears, the soft weight of his head against the floor. In those moments, a silent dialogue passed between them, fragile and unspoken. He waited, and she noted. Hours could have passed like this, though in reality it was minutes. The officers stood frozen, realizing that stepping forward might shatter the fragile trust forming in the corner of that apartment. Every sound was magnified. The drip of a faucet, the faint hum of a distant heater, the soft scrape of Rex's paw as he adjusted his position, and then a noise, a chair creaking as the girl shifted slightly. It was enough for him to react, not with aggression or alarm, but with awareness. His ears flicked, his eyes followed, his body tensed just enough to signal presence and protection. She exhaled slowly, tiny shoulders sinking for the first time in what felt like forever, and her lips curved into the faintest, hesitant smile. The officers could not take their eyes off the exchange. They had trained for years to read behavior, to interpret signals, to anticipate actions. But nothing in manuals prepared them for this. Here was a dog who understood more than obedience, who could perceive the emotional landscape of a child and respond with nuance and restraint. His training served him not as a tool, but as a lens through which he could connect. And she, in turn, responded to him in ways she could not yet articulate, her body relaxing, her breathing synchronizing to the calm rhythm he set. A moment came when she finally, tentatively, reached out a small hand. It hovered over his head for a heartbeat, unsure, trembling, and then she touched his fur. He flinched not, shifted slightly closer, and the soft rumble of contentment vibrated in his chest. She laughed then, a tiny, incredulous laugh, one born of surprise and relief, that carried with it the sound of a storm breaking and new world forming. Rex responded in kind, moving slightly, tail brushing the floor, eyes attentive but soft as if to say, "I am here. You are safe. You are not alone." Outside, the city continued its relentless hum. The rain beat against windows, cars splashed in puddles, sirens echoed faintly from streets blocks away. But inside that small apartment, a different rhythm emerged, one of fragile trust, quiet protection, and first steps toward healing. The shadows of neglect and fear were still present, etched into the walls and the air, but they had met resistance, quiet and patient, from a dog whose loyalty had transcended command. In the stillness, the officers understood, fully and silently, that sometimes the most profound rescues were not performed with urgency or authority, but with patience, observation, and unwavering presence. By the time the paramedics arrived, the scene had transformed subtly. The girl no longer shrank into herself. Her gaze sought the dog's, and her fingers brushed the damp fur on his neck as they helped her to her feet. Rex did not follow immediately. He stayed low, watchful, guarding the space, his eyes never leaving her. And in that moment, the officers realized that the story unfolding in the apartment would not end with paperwork or a ride to the hospital. It had only begun. The bond formed in silence and shadows would define the journey that lay ahead. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and fear, a mixture that clung to the air in sharp, sterile waves. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, their white glare harsh against the polished linoleum. Rex had never liked hospitals. The smells, the constant movement, the strange noises, it all set his instincts on edge. But this time, it was different. This time, the child he had guarded, the girl who had touched his fur, and in turn, touched something in his soul, was here, and he refused to leave. His handler tugged at the leash, gently at first, then with more insistence, but Rex's paws dug into the floor, nails scratching softly but determinedly. His chest pressed low, muscles taut, eyes fixed on the pediatric ward doors as though any step away would betray the silent promise he had made. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. They had seen loyalty, yes, they had seen dogs obey, protect, track, but never like this. Rex was not following orders. He was following a bond, invisible and unbreakable, and it could not be measured in commands or rules. The nurses had begun to notice. At first they thought it was odd behavior, a dog unsettled by the hospital environment. But soon they realized it was purposeful. Rex would not drink water. He would not rest in the kennel. Instead, he paced in a tight, focused circle outside the ward, pausing only when the girl, Maya, appeared in her wheelchair for fresh air or therapy. At her approach, he would stop, body relaxing fractionally, tail lowering just enough to indicate that he was aware but not a threat. And every time she reached out, even hesitantly, to touch him, he responded with patient, deliberate calm. The transformation in Maya was subtle at first, imperceptible to anyone untrained in the rhythms of fear and recovery. Her small hands no longer trembled as violently. Her breaths lengthened and softened. When she ate meals, she no longer picked at the food but chewed slowly, savoring it. At night, she slept longer stretches, the tense lines in her shoulders gradually releasing as if someone had turned down the constant pressure she had carried. And Rex, ever watchful, observed every change with quiet approval. He was both sentinel and partner in this slow reclaiming of life. Days blurred into each other. The rain outside the hospital came and went, streaking windows with liquid silver. But inside, the pattern was constant. Rex refused to leave, and Maya began to reach toward him. In the evenings, when the staff would attempt to take him back to the kennel, he would resist with soft whines and subtle tugs, eyes wide and pleading in a way that no one could ignore. Officers found themselves softening under his gaze, letting him stay, feeling the gravity of the connection they could neither control nor understand. There were moments of near panic, moments when staff feared he might hurt himself or Maya, moments when his insistence collided with policy. And yet nothing happened. He never snapped, never lashed out. His insistence was not destructive. It was protective, reverent, and somehow knowing. He had learned in his own way that trust is not demanded. It is earned, and he had chosen to wait until she could step forward on her own terms. Maya, too, began to assert small pieces of herself in this strange new order. She would call for him in the hallways, her voice tentative at first, then stronger as days passed. She would trace the scar along his ear with careful fingers, her tiny face lit by the soft glow of bedside lamps. In these quiet moments, the hospital's sterile hum receded, replaced by the rhythm of two beings slowly knitting each other back together. Visitors, nurses, and even doctors began to take notice. A child once paralyzed by fear was learning to navigate space and emotion, guided by a dog whose understanding transcended any human instruction. The turning point came one afternoon when Maya was scheduled for therapy outside the ward. The wind had picked up, rattling the large windows, and a chill ran through the hospital corridors. She hesitated at the door, feet hovering over the cold linoleum, her small hands clutching the wheelchair handles. Rex, sensing her hesitation, pressed his body low to the ground, head level with hers, eyes locked in unwavering focus. A soft whine escaped him, a sound imbued with patience and reassurance, vibrating through her chest more than her ears. And in that moment, Maya understood without words. She could move forward, but only if he stayed by her side. Together, they moved. Slowly, deliberately, Maya navigating the wheelchair while Rex walked beside her, head held low, ears alert, tail wagging just enough to signal calm. The world outside the ward seemed to recede. The beeping monitors, the sterile smells, the bustling staff, all irrelevant. It was just the two of them, step by careful step, reclaiming confidence that had been stolen by neglect, by fear, by circumstance. And the hospital watched, silent and reverent, as trust became tangible, as love became action. In the evenings, when the lights dimmed and the corridors emptied, Maya would lay back against her pillow and call for him. Rex would appear without fail, padding softly across the hallway, the sound of his paws a lullaby she had come to recognize. She would trace her fingers over his fur, whispering secrets she could not share aloud, and he would respond with warmth, with presence, with unspoken understanding. It was a cycle of reassurance, a slow building of courage, and with every passing day, invisible wall around her heart cracked a little further. The staff began to notice subtle patterns too. Her appetite was improving. Her laughter, soft at first, began to fill small corners of the ward. The anxiety that once sharpened her gaze had dulled to manageable edges. Rex's refusal to leave was no longer an inconvenience, but a catalyst for recovery. Even the doctors, skeptical at first, began to refer to him as a therapeutic presence, a living bridge between trauma and healing. And yet for Rex, there was no performative aspect to his actions. There was no reward. Only the quiet, steadfast knowledge that some promises cannot be broken and some bonds cannot be ignored. One night, as rain streaked the hospital windows in thin, relentless lines, Maya curled beneath her blanket, whispering softly, "I'm not afraid." Rex lay at the foot of her bed, ears flicked back, eyes soft but alert, a living shield against a world that had once felt unsafe. The room was silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional drip of water from the roof. And in that quiet, the truth was undeniable. Healing was not linear, was not controlled, and it often came from the most unexpected sources. In this case, it came from a dog who refused to leave, who refused to obey any command that would break the delicate, vital trust between him and a child. The bond was extraordinary. It defied training, defied expectation, defied logic. And as Maya slept, small breaths steadying, Rex rested his head near hers, vigilant, patient, unmovable. Outside, the city's chaos continued. Rain, traffic, neon lights. But inside that ward, a miracle was quietly unfolding. The child who had been so alone, so frightened, had found a guardian, and the dog who had been trained to enforce order had found purpose beyond duty. Together, they began to stitch the fractures of fear and neglect into a fragile, resilient whole. And for Rex, refusal to let go was not obstinacy. It was love, unwavering and absolute, a promise written not in words, but in presence, in patience, in every careful step that kept them both safe in a world that had seemed determined to let them fall. The hospital corridors smelled faintly of antiseptic, but the air now carried a heavier tension, thick with questions that had no easy answers. Maya had begun to settle into a fragile routine, her small victories marked by cautious smiles and measured breaths, yet the calm was precarious. Rex, as always, was at her side, a constant presence that refused to be reasoned away. But now, the quiet persistence of the dog's loyalty was beginning to collide with the world around them. Policies, rules, and human assumptions that refused to bend to intuition or emotion. The truth about Maya's life emerged in fragments, whispered by nurses who had started to pay attention, documented in hastily written notes by social workers, and revealed in casual conversations that cut deeper than any official report. Her mother had been ill, trapped in an illness that consumed her attention and capacity, leaving Maya alone in an apartment that had grown darker with each passing day. Meals were irregular, light switches often remained off, and the thin blanket she clutched for warmth had become her armor. She had cried for days on end, a lonely, rasping sound that had finally reached the ears of neighbors who had called the authorities. And now, in the sterile brightness of the hospital, all of that history pressed into the present weighty, and undeniable. Rex had understood it all before anyone else did. Every whine, every gentle nudge, every careful adjustment of his body in response to Maya's hesitations spoke of a comprehension that went beyond instinct. He had not needed the files, the interviews, or the whispered explanations. He had felt the story in her scent, in the tremor of her small hands, in the rhythm of her breath. The officers and hospital staff watched with a mixture of awe and unease as the dog seemed to absorb her history, carrying it with patience and quiet reverence. And yet, this understanding made them uncomfortable. Rules were rules. Dogs were not supposed to bond this intensely, this independently. Their insistence on protocol collided with Rex's unwavering determination. It reached a breaking point one afternoon. Maya had been scheduled for an evaluation, a session that would determine the next steps in her care. The doors of the pediatric ward opened, bright fluorescent light spilling into the hall, and the staff prepared to take her inside. Rex, as usual, positioned himself at the wheelchair, lowering his head and fixing her with those unrelenting eyes. The nurse bent to lift him aside, speaking gently, but he stiffened, pressing himself low to the floor, a growl rumbling softly from his chest. It was not an act of aggression. It was a refusal, a protective boundary that demanded recognition. Everyone froze. The staff exchanged tense glances. The handler tugged at his leash, voice calm but firm, yet the dog remained immovable. The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with the weight of unspoken stakes. Then Maya, small and fragile, looked at him. Her lips trembled, and she whispered, barely audible, "A please, don't leave me." That single delicate plea shifted the balance. The room's tension dissolved into a silence heavy with understanding. The dog relaxed, moving only enough to walk beside her, head level with her small frame, tail low but steady. It was a silent agreement. He would not abandon her, and she would meet him halfway. In the following days, the revelations continued. Social workers pieced together her life, uncovering the neglect that had been allowed to fester and the gaps that had almost gone unnoticed. Maya's mother, once invisible behind illness, appeared briefly to offer fragments of apologies, explanations, and confusion. But even she could not contest the extraordinary bond that had formed in the shadow of neglect. Every observer recognized it. The dog had become more than a companion. He was an anchor, a stabilizing force in a storm that had raged unchecked for far too long. Rex's behavior became a mirror for the child's recovery. On the days when she felt anxious, he would pace slowly, nose down, tail brushing lightly against the floor, drawing her attention back to the moment, reminding her she was safe. On the days when she found courage, he would match her pace, moving proudly at her side, a reflection of confidence and trust that could not be taught. Staff began to take note of patterns that defied logic. Meals eaten fully, therapy sessions completed with cooperation, laughter, the faintest of smiles that had been missing for months. And through it all, Rex maintained his vigil, patient and unyielding, a living testament to the power of recognition, presence, and understanding. But the staff could not ignore the strain. Rex refused rest. He refused to follow routine commands. His insistence was becoming a concern, a challenge to the policies that governed the hospital. And yet, no one could bring themselves to break the bond he had forged. They began to adapt, bending rules slowly, watching as the child's progress grew directly in proportion to the dog's presence. Therapy sessions were rescheduled to include him. Quiet times were built around his visits. Even meals were planned so that Maya could share moments of calm with him nearby. And through all of it, the dog seemed to measure his actions with precision, calibrating every movement to ensure her comfort and safety. The climax of revelation came when a new volunteer entered the ward, unaware of the history, and attempted to redirect Rex toward the kennel. The dog stiffened immediately, a low, resonant growl warning of boundaries crossed. Maya's hands gripped the edge of her wheelchair, knuckles white, and she shook her head. "Oh no," she whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. "He stays." The volunteer froze, realization dawning. The staff and observers understood fully for the first time. The dog's loyalty had transcended training, rules, and expectation. It was sacred, unwavering, a force that demanded respect. And in that recognition, the truth became undeniable. Rex had chosen, not by command, not by reward, but by pure conscious devotion to a child in need. That evening, As the rain streaked the windows in endless ribbons, Maya rested on her bed, small fingers tracing patterns along Rex's thick fur. He lay at her side, head level with her chest, eyes soft but alert, breathing slow and steady. The ward was quiet, the chaos of the city muted by walls and floors, and yet within that stillness was a revelation stronger than any policy, louder than any siren. Some bonds cannot be explained. Some promises cannot be broken. And some rescues are not completed in haste but in patience, understanding, and unwavering presence. The truth, now clear to all who had witnessed it, was that Maya had survived not because of procedure or protocol, but because of a dog who refused to leave. A dog who had understood her before anyone else did. And in that revelation, the world was forced to reckon with the extraordinary. A loyalty and love so profound it defied expectation, and a child's recovery so dependent on it that no other intervention could replicate. The storm outside continued, indifferent and relentless, but inside, the small ward became a haven of recognition, trust, and healing, a testament to the quiet, patient work of love. And for Rex, there was no finality in this revelation, no applause, no reward. Only the satisfaction of presence, the fulfillment of an unspoken promise. The child he had chosen to protect was safe, her small breath steady, her fragile body learning to trust the world again. And in that, the extraordinary truth of their bond was undeniable. Some rescues do not end when the child is lifted or the paperwork filed. Some rescues begin and continue in the quiet insistence of love that refuses to let go. The morning sun filtered through the hospital blinds in thin golden streaks, catching dust particles that danced lazily in the quiet air. Maya stirred, small hands reaching for the blanket that had been her shield for months, only to find the familiar warmth of Rex's fur pressed gently against her side. He had not moved through the night, not once, head resting near her small frame. Ears flicked toward every creak of the floor, tail brushing the edges of her bed like a soft punctuation of presence. Outside, the city began its noisy awakening, cars splashing through puddles, sirens wailing in the distance. But inside the pediatric ward, time seemed to move differently, measured by breaths, touches, and quiet companionship. Rex had become more than a therapy dog, more than a police 9 trained for duty. He was the axis around which Maya's new world turned. Staff had adapted, creating routines that accommodated the unbreakable bond between child and dog. Meals, therapy sessions, walks through the hospital garden, all were structured with his presence as a requirement, not a luxury. Maya had transformed subtly but unmistakably. Shoulders lifted, gaze steadier, fingers no longer trembling when brushing against a hand or a page of a book. She laughed softly at small jokes, whispered secrets to Rex, and began to speak of herself in ways that had once been impossible. And through it all, the dog remained patient, steady, unwavering, a living bridge from fear to hope. The breakthrough came one crisp afternoon in the hospital garden. The air was sharp with winter chill, the smell of wet earth and grass clinging to the edges of every breath. Nurses had wheeled Maya outside, and Rex padded beside her, tail held in careful balance, ears alert. She paused near a patch of sunlight, toes brushing damp grass, her small face lifting to the warmth. She turned to him, eyes bright, and whispered, "I can do it." It was a simple declaration, almost lost to the hum of the city beyond the walls, but for Rex, it was everything. Slowly, deliberately, she took a small step forward, then another, and he matched her pace exactly, head level with her, eyes unwavering. The world around them receded, the garden, the traffic, the distant noise of the city, all disappeared. There was only this moment, fragile and fleeting, yet monumental in its significance. From that day, Maya's confidence grew in ways no one could have predicted, as she learned to navigate corridors, steps, and outdoor spaces with Rex by her side. Small victories, pouring a glass of water, feeding a small bird in the garden, walking to the nurse's station alone, were celebrated quietly, acknowledged with a brush of her hand against his fur, a soft word of gratitude whispered in the spaces between breaths. The bond that had begun in fear, forged in necessity, matured into trust so profound that it became almost sacred. Even her mother, present occasionally under supervision, could not contest the change. She watched as the child who had once been withdrawn, fearful and fragile, now moved with a quiet determination. laughter spilling at times from lips that had barely curved in years. She observed, sometimes tearfully, the extraordinary way a dog had reshaped the course of a child's life, how his presence made neglect and fear momentarily irrelevant, how his insistence on loyalty had given her daughter a chance to reclaim herself. The hospital staff began to speak of them in hushed tones, as if discussing something extraordinary and sacred. Doctors noted improvements in appetite, sleep patterns, and mood. Therapists remarked on newfound courage. Volunteers who had once been unsure about the dog's presence now deferred to him instinctively, understanding that to disturb the rhythm of trust between child and canine was to interfere with the very healing unfolding in front of them. And Rex, always patient, always vigilant, seemed to measure every interaction, calibrating every movement to preserve the fragile balance he had helped establish. The city outside continued to pulse with its relentless rhythm, buses rattling over uneven streets, shopkeepers setting up for the day, rain-slicked asphalt glistening in the morning light. But inside the ward, a different rhythm governed life. It was measured not by schedules or alarms, but by trust, breath, and the quiet insistence of presence. Maya's laughter, soft and unguarded, became a punctuation mark to the slow, steady heartbeat of recovery. Rex's low whine, once a sound of anxiety or insistence, now carried reassurance, approval, and steadfast companionship. Together, they navigated the complexities of trauma, fear, and healing, one step, one breath, one touch at a time. Weeks passed. The initial chaos of emergency had settled into a routine, but the bond remained unshaken. Even when visitors came, even when routine procedures resumed, Maya would call for him with a glance, a soft whisper, a subtle gesture, and Rex would respond without hesitation. The transformation was not only hers, but the hospital's. The staff who had once viewed him as an anomaly now recognized the extraordinary power of loyalty, empathy, and connection beyond words. Maya's world expanded slowly but irrevocably. The shadows that had haunted her apartment, the fear that had stalked her nightly, began to recede, replaced with cautious optimism, curiosity, and even joy. The culmination came on a quiet evening, the sun low and golden streaking the ward with warmth. Maya sat in her wheelchair by the window, the city sprawling beneath her in muted chaos. Rex lay nearby, head resting on his paws, eyes flicking toward her, ever vigilant. She reached out, fingers brushing his fur, and whispered, "You're my home." The words were small, simple, but they carried the weight of months of fear, struggle, and the extraordinary journey they had shared. For Rex, there was no response in words, only a slight wag of the tail, the softest rumble vibrating through his chest, a quiet echo of recognition and love. In that moment, the city beyond the walls, its noise, its chaos, its indifference, felt distant. Inside the ward, within the fragile cocoon of trust and love, a child had reclaimed her world, and a dog had fulfilled a promise written in instinct, loyalty, and unyielding patience. The bond was not something that could be cataloged, explained, or confined. It was alive, breathing, moving through every gesture, every glance, every shared heartbeat. Maya had a protector, Rex had a purpose, and together they had found a home not in walls or streets but in the heart. As dusk fell and the first stars appeared in the sky outside the hospital, Maya leaned gently against Rex, the warmth of his fur a tether to a world that had once felt unrelentingly cold. The rain had stopped for the night, leaving streets glistening and reflecting neon lights like liquid mirrors. But the warmth inside the ward endured. Trust had been built, fear had been tamed. Love, quiet and patient, had triumphed. And in the stillness, in the golden light, the child and the dog sat together, guardians of each other's fragile, precious world. It was a story without fanfare, without headlines. Yet it carried the weight of 1,000 rescues. Some rescues are loud and chaotic. Some are quiet and profound. This was the latter, a testament to patience, loyalty, and the transformative power of presence. The city might forget, the rain might wash the streets clean, but the bond between Maya and Rex would endure, a permanent echo of courage, love, and the truth that sometimes home is found not in walls or buildings, but in the heart of another being who refuses to let go.